Well, today we're exploring one of the most consequential yet least discussed topics in biotech. How do the decisions you make in your first year of fundraising essentially lock in your trajectory for the next decade? The source of your capital, the partnerships you forge, the regulatory pathway you choose, all of these decisions fundamentally shape what's possible for the drug candidate and your company. Today, my guest is Monica Rosoff, CEO of Labal Alianza, who has spent over 20 years navigating these exact decisions from inside of some of the biopharma's most successful companies, like Genentech, Gilead, Kite. She's led deals, managed partnerships, guided clinical programs, and seen firsthand how early choices compound over time. Monica, good to have you.
Thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
Well, tell me, how did you even start your career in M&A and deal making and fundraising? What brought you there?
Well, I think that it's a little bit, so I'm a scientist by training, and I really hate inefficiency. So it's a little bit ironic, but the plain truth is that I was a PhD doing Wnt signaling research, and there is no pharma application for Wnt signaling practically. There is a tiny one now, and so those of us who cannot practice directly then go to alternative fields, and so I ended up in business development, and that's how I got into it. And I really got my feet wet a little bit in sequencing technology, development, and then switched over to pharma when I went to Genentech.
Fantastic. Well, today we're going to talk about the biotech primarily. And
Yeah.
let's start with a provocative claim. So I would argue that most founders are actually making their most important strategic decisions before they should, before they have enough information to make them well. So when I recently looked at early stage biotech companies over the past decade, there was I observed a pattern, and the pattern is that the ones that achieved the highest exit valuations were not necessarily the ones with the best science, and they were the ones who made very deliberate, informed choices across three domains: who their capital partners would be, what indication they would pursue, and what regulatory pathway they would take.
Mhm.
And here's the thing: that most founders make these decisions almost reflexively. They get introduced to VC, they take the first term sheet, they pick an indication because the founding scientist worked on it, and they assume that accelerated approval is always better. So from your perspective in the industry, um, what's the gap that you see between how founders or first-time CEOs think about these decisions and how they should be thinking about these decisions?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think the first thing is who you surround yourself with, right? I mean, it's really important to have, you'll have your team that to some extent will be driven by whoever's putting down the dollars at the beginning to some extent, right? Those they're choosing the team to some, but I think what's really important is what experts are you additionally like looking out and sort of recruiting to get the right inputs to plan your to make your plan. And that's where I see people sort of failing a little bit. It's so hard, you're starting your company, you have a handful of people, you probably don't have enough funding, and so the last thing you want to do is sort of spend more money or take more time. But it's sort of like the question of the go fast to go slow or go slow to go fast, right? That's really the thing, right? And a lot of people do the former, not the latter, and that's where you end up cutting off options for yourself that would then be the high value exits. So the biggest, I'd say, first mistake is not seeking out the sort of expertise, which is out there and sometimes is free. It just, you just have to take the time to look for it and listen. In particular, when it comes to questions of clinical development, what do you want to look for in your, IND pack? What should you have in your IND package? How far, how do you choose your lead? That's how many times have we heard? I mean, I've definitely heard, oh, we picked the wrong lead. If we'd only known, or if we'd only done this other thing, so I think it's really about kind of surrounding yourself with more inputs early on, and really pressure testing your assumptions rather than run and not stop and question what you're doing.
So let's talk about the first big controversy. Fundraising has fundamentally changed in the last 3 to 5 years.
Yes.
Royalty financing has exploded. We're seeing 85% of biopharma executives now considering or already using alternative funding structures. So here is the thing. On one hand, you've got founders saying, I don't want to give up equity. I don't want investors on my board. I want to run my company. I've seen those founders myself. That's completely understandable. You build something, you want to control it. But on the other hand, you've got the data showing that most billion-dollar exits had deep venture capital involvement. VCs brought operational expertise, board-level strategic guidance, networks that genuinely accelerated growth of those companies. So the question that I have is that value, is that venture capital value a feature or a bug? And do you actually need it? Or are founders just paying for something they could do themselves?
Well, I actually think that they need the venture capital. To me, it's like a yes and kind of question. It's not one or the other. You don't need to choose. You probably need to do both. And so I would say that the big thing is which venture capital. I mean, and of course that sounds so luxurious right now. I'm painfully aware that most founders right now are really struggling to find the money, right? But who funds you is very important, because it could be you could sink your ship, or set yourself up for success with that very first decision. And so keeping an open mind, and really trying to keep your options open is very, very important. But I don't think it's one or the other. I actually think there's a timing part to it. Early on, the venture capital makes a lot of sense. I mean, you've got all your IP costs, you've got to get your team together. Usually they're extremely well networked. I mean, you really want to you don't want to do from scratch all on your own. What can be done more efficiently for you to some extent, to move fast at the beginning. But then at some point, usually when you're starting to, if you're getting into the clinic, that seems to me like the optimal time, when you have some proof of concept data to look at that royalty. For example, looking at selling a royalty stream, or like looking at deals that sell off a territory, or if there's other deal structures that are non-dilutive that would help fund sort of the later stage expensive clinical trials. So I think you should. I really think that a lot of the successful drugs have done both. And the high valuations come with, a large TAM and an indication that, that's sort of global. And that's where you see those really come through. So I think you have to kind of sequence them a little bit.
Okay, I see. So when you work with biotech, first, I think about first-time CEOs, because these folks primarily they've never done this before. They have these questions, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you help them think through the process of when to start reaching out to venture capital firms? That's one. And what are the hidden costs of independence that aren't obvious on a cap table?
I think that I would recommend venture capital. I think that, starting with a safe and starting with, before you go to venture capital, right, you can start with sort of expert investors. They'll give you the path to the venture capitalists, right? So if you can start with, a scientific hypothesis and like your basic IP, and then go from there to a small network of sort of very motivated believers that understand the science and that know and that have the expertise to then help you network to get your company set up. I think that's probably the ideal. And then they will then through the network for the venture capitalists, I'd say that you have to be on the inside. So you really need people that already have that network. And that's how you can kind of become introduced. Either that or you're being picked from the start by a venture capitalist, a firm already, like a fund that's setting up a company, and then they bring you in to be a founder. But if you're starting from scratch on your own with your own idea, then starting with safes and kind of building up your network that way is a viable option, and maybe a little preserves your value a little more.
Another question I have for you. So you and I
Mhm.
are big proponents of royalty financing these days.
Yeah.
When is the right time to start thinking about this?
So I think that you should think about it when you're thinking about your development plan, right? I mean, you really need to think about it in the context of what size clinical studies are you doing, where are you doing them, what's your regulatory, kind of like where are you going to seek approval first, second, third, what territories. You really need to have a good idea about that to then allow yourself the sort of a plan to how you're going to maybe parse out the territories, or what data set is going to trigger you to go like big or stay small. So a lot of it starts with sort of the choice, like you were saying at the beginning, of the indication and what's your market looking like. And so you really need to think about the development plan first based on what your molecule or what your asset, what the properties are for that asset.
So what I've seen so far, the majority of royalty financing deals happen at phase 3
Mm-hmm.
and above. However, I've seen some interest from the phase 2, late phase 2
Yeah.
companies, but the investors are not ready to make those commitments until they
Yep.
see some preliminary data. But from what I also observed recently is a lot of many companies look at royalty financing as a potential to extend their cash runway, essentially.
As they have for historically. Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So is your question basically when to start, or can we go earlier?
When to start, and are we going to see the trend moving towards earlier stages?
Yeah, I think I mean, if you look at the like I was before our call, I was checking out the Royalty Pharma deal sheets, right? I mean, they're like great place to look historically at what's been done, right? And sure, for sure, like they mostly like it's a lower risk kind of model, right? Like phase 3, maybe phase 2 if there's some good data. Um and it is going earlier. I think that's a little bit driven by just the situation right now with the sort of venture funding being really tight and stuff. But I think in general, it's a late stage kind of a deal. And if you go earlier, what you need to realize is that it's gonna be a very expensive deal for you. And if you want to have that nice big fat exit later, that could really impact you, because then the buyer won't have enough, like the royalty burden will be too high on the asset. So you have to be keeping track of that. You don't want a situation where the royalty burden just removes all profit from the product, and which I have seen. It does happen. If you slice that salami a little too thin and have too many royalties going in all sorts of directions because you were fundraising out of necessity, the whole way through, that better be a firecracker product to actually make it, and which they are sometimes, but it makes it tough. So if you're doing the royalty fundraising, it's probably going to be when you have a really nice data set.
Well, now let's talk about another important topic, which is often underappreciated.
Yeah.
Every biotech founder makes a decision about what disease they're going to tackle, and that choice made it in year one often determines the company's entire trajectory. Um, Sometimes I feel like this decision is made almost casually. Founders pick indications based on what their founders, scientists worked on and what seems most obvious from the biology standpoint. They don't think about what happens 6 years later when they need Series D capital and Big Pharma suddenly cares whether your market is $2 billion or $20 billion. Um, so the math is really brutal here, especially when you start thinking about the rare indications. Rare diseases have regulatory advantages, orphan
Hmm.
designations, accelerated approval pathways. That's attractive when you're small and need to do risk, but they also command lower valuations at exit usually, right?
Yes.
So a lot of companies start looking into large markets, cardiovascular, metabolic disease, oncology, and such, but they're very crowded and very expensive. So you've got this sort of perverse incentives. VCs will fund you to run a rare disease trial quickly, but then you can't raise Series D because the exit value isn't compelling enough for the big pharma that would acquire you. So from your perspective, how do you even start thinking about the indication selection? How do you start thinking about evaluating the assets and programs? I would like to hear your opinion.
Yeah, so I think so there's a couple things. The first one is sort of how beautiful of a molecule or an antibody or an ADC is it? Like what's your lead kind of like what's the hints of the efficacy, right? Like what does it look like? If it looks just fantastic, right? Then you really need to think carefully about probably a larger indication if it's amenable, right? Like if it's sort of a potential for broad indication. That's the first thing is like, what does it look like? Does it look efficacious? If it doesn't look that efficacious, honestly, and I'm not, I'm a scientist by training, but I'm not a doctor, right? I'm not an MD, but if you go back and do a search on how many drugs have been removed from the market, including very efficacious drugs, right? Something that's like third or fourth in class, or just not that great. It's never going to make like enough money for the big pharmas to really pay top dollar for it, right? So in those cases, does it have an orphan indication? I'm not advocating that only the lower efficacy drugs should only be heading for orphan at all. But I'm just saying that like you should probably give it up and not pursue something if it's a really large indication. It has to be very, very competitive, right? And the market's so competitive. There's like a bazillion of every single target. Like there's shot on goal or two by every big pharma. On the rare indication side, and like I see a lot of like you said, like people saying, well, we're going to start with the orphan indication. We're going to go really fast. And then we're going to expand to to this broader indication with a really high value. And I think that the focus is a virtue. And if you do it, like really understanding kind of what you're going to do, what data you need to get like a solid approval, and having that commercial assessment for how you're going to be profitable in that indication is really the way to go. And so it really has to be tailored in my mind for the orphan indication, the rare disease side, especially now. Before there was also the vouchers, you could at least like get a voucher and you could sell it, and or there's the reasons to kind of do other things. Now right now is not really that time. And also with all of the pricing, we're such the market's evolving so fast. It's really hard to know what's going to happen. I don't know if people are going to be able to price super high or not, right? And so there's just a lot of variables. So I think that just focusing is the other thing that like I would beg people to do, is to focus on one. Don't say yes and we're going to do the world. Just focus on either on whatever you think actually is going to bring the patient like true value, and that's what you should do. If it's a large indication and it's sort of marginal, it's just probably not going to make it.
And how do you balance early stage funding accessibility against late stage commercial value?
Well, I think that early on you're so limited in your options, right? And so I think that the way to balance it is to give the funders enough rights early to kind of have a bite at the apple, but like don't just give it away. Like try to give people access and give yourself optionality and them too, but also give yourself enough of a toehold to then be able to kind of pivot if you need to other partners later on. So I'll give you an example. Like if someone's giving you like your early funding and they want to write a right to license or right of first negotiation or right of first refusal or something like that. Sure, but maybe it's very time bound and you have a way to unwind it. Basically, if you have doors, you can close the doors, but they'll lock them and give them the key, right? Because then you'll never be able to. They'll have you, and you'll never be able to go and seek funding or kind of pivot to another partner if you need to later. So I think that's one of the ways that you balance that risk early, and then later, I think it's all about sort of having a clear plan and having your data all buttoned up and clean and just very understandable and again focused. Just having a really clear package is the most important thing I think for later to drive those valuations higher, is to make that strong case for the commercial success of the product.
So there is this tension in the venture capital world between what I would call the R&D factory mentality and the single asset sprint.
Mm-hmm.
Platform companies building foundational technologies that can be applied to multiple indications, they sound great in theory. Multiple shots on goal, resilience. If your first program fails, you have others in the pipeline. I'm a big proponent of platform strategies. The problem is they require enormous upfront capital, and you're asking investors to fund your platform for years before you have any revenue or even clinical proof of concept. And the data is messier than venture capital firms usually like to admit.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think about the single asset companies, they are the opposite, right? They are very focused. They have faster path to proof of concept. But if your one program fails, you're basically done. What is your opinion on how to approach this decision making from one asset or the platform approach?
So I think my experience is that it's a lot of the platform plays um, actually end up in licensing an asset to be their lead asset because their platform isn't ready. I've seen that a bunch of times. And so you're right about the whole, it takes forever for the, platform to mature. And I guess I was thinking about this question before we sat down together. And I really think that if you have a platform, it's ideally you can fund a specific focused collaboration. And even more ideally, you should drive, like you as a founder should drive what the asset is and try to find a collaboration partner that is aligned with your goals there. Because if you just if you kind of go out and push the platform, sell the platform, the issue I see is that most companies will come to you with their most difficult cases that they can't solve internally. And they're like, maybe your platform can do this for us. And it's the most technically difficult thing of all of them. And so your likelihood of success is extremely low. And so that's a bit of an opportunity cost for you. So my advice would be, if you are doing a platform play, is think about what specific asset you want to go after and start with that. And just profile the pharma companies, the mid-sized biotechs, and try to find one that was willing to collaborate with you on that. and then go that route. And then so that you end up as soon as possible with an asset to then drive the value for that. So it's kind of like a yes and again. And also, if you do have a platform, for the love of everything, please manage your IP super carefully, because that's the other piece that's really challenging with platform plays is you need a lot of IP rights to stay with you, and most folks want those IP rights to go to the buyer, and so you need to have a really tight IP strategy as well.
So what is the future of biotech? Is it platform or single asset plays? What's your bet?
I went to the Swiss HLG meeting this year, right? The future still seems to me to be small molecules, frankly. I mean, if you look at the volume, and so if you think about it from a sort of population health perspective, in terms of what's cheap, what's deployable, blah blah blah. The vast majority of the drugs are still still small molecules. That being said, multiple film, I know so many people that we all do biologics. It's like a totally ho-hum kind of thing these days. And so obviously that's not going away. And I would love to see, I'm very excited about sort of like, the gene therapy, like the little girl that can hear now. And, I really do think that there's a lot of a really exciting kind of individualized therapies out there. And I'm an RNA person. That's what I did. So I'm hopeful that that we'll stop being so down on RNA technology, because that also has like tremendous applications, especially on the vaccines and oncology. It'd be great to see that sort of go. So I think that's kind of the future. But just from a volume perspective and from a population health perspective, it's small molecules. I know that's super boring, but it's not.
That it's very cost effective. So we are on the same page on this one.
Yeah, and shippable.
Yes, exactly. So let's talk about the FDA process and the regulatory strategy. I always advocate that the early stage biotech startups, they need to be having conversations with FDA as early as possible.
Yes.
until it's too late.
Yeah.
So accelerated approval recently felt like a gift. Get your drug to patients faster, prove clinical benefit, post-market trials, compressed timelines, and companies have been building entire development strategies around hitting accelerated approval pathways. So now we know that there is this new guidance that tightens that substantially. Confirmatory trials need to be underway at approval time. Sometimes enrollment needs to be complete. And if you don't demonstrate diligence, the FDA can withdraw approval much faster than they used to. Well, one question that I have for you is, when do you think, first of all, what is your opinion on when biotech startups need to start engaging with the FDA? That's one. And I also think that what I just mentioned, it creates a lot of strategic tension for early stage companies. So do you spend heavily upfront to design phase 3 scale trials in parallel with phase 2, but that will dramatically increase costs and complexity? Or do you pursue the traditional pathway, which takes longer but spread costs more evenly across a longer timeline?
Okay, and remind me, the first question is when to engage, right? So,
Yes.
so I agree with you that feedback should be sought as early as possible. I think that the only sort of tweak to that I would make is, again, like there's a lot of really excellent regulatory knowledgeable people out there that could really give you some great insight into what you should be looking for, and not just on the clinical trial execution, or I guess there's a few groups, right? It's so important to talk to practicing MDs that have done these sorts of studies before and that really know how a potential drug is going to be used. And so what I've seen like over my career with the partnerships is that the studies that really go well and fast are led by, executives that really have done these exact same studies before. They know every nuance. They look at all the data, and they are in there. And that's definitely the case. For example, I'll give a shout out. John McCutcheon did a beautiful job when they got sofosbuvir approved from Pharmasset to Gilead, and it was because of that kind of engagement. So I think, have the right kind of experts that can lead your programs, but also give you the input early on the medical side, also on the statistical side. Do you have the right kind of statistical, design? And that's one area that falls apart quite a bit. But and there's also this sort of like a saying that, like, don't ask what you don't want to know. I'm sorry, but you probably want to know at some point. There's very few things that you don't want to know forever. And so how you ask those questions, maybe you risk, you time them so that you're asking at the right time. That makes sense. Like, don't do a talk study at the wrong time or something, but you really want to know. And so those are the main things. So eat early, but get the experts first before you go to the FDA. And then in terms of how to, like, what to do with a fully designed phase 3 or not, and that tension, I guess what I would say again, when I've seen really successful development plans executed, a lot of the work was done early. And I mean, like, phase 1. Do you know your PK? Do you know if the PK is reliable? Are you going to get good data from your study? If you need to take, biopsies, are you able to do that regularly? Things like that. Like, really look early, like phase 1, at what you're getting, and look at your talks. Do your talks thoroughly early. Do those like receptor binding studies thoroughly, so that you have an idea what the mechanism is for the talks or not, when the FDA asks. So a lot of this stuff is really front loaded, which is hard because that's when you don't have the money, right? But I guess my point is that those are the tools you need and the information you need to then decide, oh yeah, we can go and do a really good phase 3 study, like just full out, or we can go for accelerated approval. I did some research before our call, and there was a whole paper in the Lancet on accelerated approvals, which I would recommend people looking up. But of accelerated approvals, about a third are withdrawn, and a third go into regular. And that's before these changes of these rules. And so I guess what I see sometimes is with the rush is that you get kind of like uninterpretable phase 2 data because the study's just not tight enough. And then you end up having to do another phase 2 or 2. And then you end up not being in accelerated approval anyway. So I guess the risks to selecting accelerated approval are pretty high, not only from the withdrawal, but from the just the chances that you're going to have to rejigger your studies later. Finally, I would say that the other huge failure mode I see with the startups and with smaller companies is instability in the chief development officer role. And all hell breaks loose when they like switch chief development officers every like year or two. And that's like the kiss of death. And so if you want if you want to have a smooth, path to registration, whether it's accelerated or not, that's, you got to really manage that all the way to the board.
Keep your chief development officer happy.
Well, and have a good one.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you really need a good one, so yeah.
So I've heard anecdotally that some founders are quietly shifting their primary development strategies to international markets, Australia, the UK, EU, where regulatory agencies are perceived as more flexible. So that's both clever and risky. How are you advising your clients think into this?
I think Australia is a great choice. And I'm actually in Europe, so I don't mean to be, dissing Europe or anything, but I've just seen Australia like punch way above its weight when it comes to early stage trials. And my only piece of advice there is if you have multiple indications, and just make sure you do your INDs like nice and individual, so you're not tying up your so you can sell your assets later if you would like, with minimal issues, or out license them or whatever you want to do. But Australia is great. I'll put a little plug in for Spain. Spain's actually very, because that's where I'm headquartered for my consultancy, and they're really growing their clinical trial capability. Look at Korea. That's the other one that I would put out there. Korea is an obvious option. A lot of the sort of Asian countries are just, and China is just, if they're going a whole so fast compared to the rest of the world, and when it comes to clinical trial completion, that there's a lot of options there. But I'd say for Europe, what I'd say is that it's, what I'm really tracking is the data and their data management and the way that they're kind of integrating the data. And so I'm really looking to see for more like population health type of studies. There was recently a cardiovascular health study that was a big one population wise. So I think that there's some, maybe like depending on what your study is focused on, then there's some options. But the EU needs to go faster when it comes to the EMA. There's no two ways about it. And Japan has just made their regulations faster too. So they're trying. So everyone's kind of pushing. But Australia's top.
All right, let's talk about the partnership versus independence. This is one of the topics that I really looked forward to talking about. So IPOs have become almost impossible for early stage biotech.
Yes.
The path from Series A or B to public markets has essentially closed over the past couple
Mm-hmm.
years. So the realistic exit scenarios have collapsed into one category: partnering with Big Pharma.
Pretty much.
But pretty much, right? So here is where it gets contentious. Those partnerships provide obvious benefits: capital, validation, enormous operational infrastructure. But they also come at a cost. You're surrendering significant upside. You're ceding control over commercialization strategy. Companies that retained independence and made it to late stage clinical data commanded higher valuations at exit, but they also had significantly higher burn rates and operational complexity, right? So they were genuinely running harder and spending more and quite risky. What is your opinion on, should we partner? Should we not? And how to even approach this topic?
Okay. So I definitely think that you should partner. I mean, I don't know a single, honestly, I don't know a single, of course I am a partnering person. So of course I don't know, but I don't know any molecules that don't have partners, like multiple, many partners. Like if you look at the history, usually it's crazy actually for most of the molecules. It's very rare for, the molecule's born, now it treats patients and it was owned by one company. That like almost never happens. Right. So definitely partner, but I think that I think again, optionality, I'm a big fan of optionality. Like don't have one partner, have several, whether it's for different territories. You don't want one partner to control you. And I mean that both from a decision-making standpoint, and I mean from a financial standpoint, because that can be highly risky. So I think it's very important to be able to work with multiple partners. Let's imagine that you want to get bought out. I mean, look what happened with Metsera recently. I don't think that they were both partners, right? But if you're going to have a sort of like for example, board observer, the pharma board observer, have two. Have them make sure that you're not sort of like basically entrapped in one's relationship. That'll also help with the health of the relationship. Because you won't be dependent entirely on them, and really again seek out advice about partnerships. That's the other thing I really think small biotechs miss out on, is that just like the regulatory and quality, there is a lot of expertise out there. And the thing is that you can really kind of cook your goose early when it comes to partnerships. You promise too much, you promise some sort of, non-compete or exclusivity or whatever. And you end up with your hands tied, and then you can't proceed and either sell your asset to someone else, and you don't have the resources to pursue your own asset that well. You can really kind of mess yourself up. So I think making sure that you have some options, and that it's really clear what they have and what the deliverables are for that partnership. Again, that's another thing. Make sure that you actually have some expertise on how you're supposed to manage the partnership, which is what I do. But yeah, I mean, that's really the thing. And going to the IPO, it's exciting and it's good to IPO, but I have seen companies IPO and then just go bankrupt because they happen to invest too much in a manufacturing facility or whatever. And so there's definitely lots and lots of risks. And so even if you did IPO, again, partner. If you're climbing a tree, stand on two different branches and hold on to a third branch. So.
And from the timeline perspective, should founders be structuring from day one for this big pharma integration, or building for independence as long as they possibly can?
That's a great question. I think, if you for example, if you look at Nimbus, they're structured for partnering from the beginning, right? They have a really nice structure in the sense that they kind of have some entities that hold the IP for different assets. So you can from the start do that. I'd say that the thing to watch out for is that implies a lot more legal costs and financial, just a lot of cost. And so if you want to run really lean, I don't think you have to do that. It's just more about if you get to a point where you really see that you have an asset that's going to be something, then you could bleb it off into its own entity or whatever. So I don't think you have to start with a structure. You can just start out with your normal, regular kind of startup structure. And then maybe if you're starting to get your IND package together, then it's time to decide if you need to do anything. Probably not. If you have more than one asset, maybe. But if your model from the start is going to be to kind of if you're a platform company and right away you're going to have 5 assets going at once or something like that, then that probably makes sense to do early.
So what strikes me about these 5 decisions that we just talked about in this conversation is that they're not really independent. They are very much deeply interconnected. So if you choose a rare disease indication, that shapes what partnerships are realistic. If you pursue a platform strategy, that sort of determines your capital requirements and the timeline, which influences whether you stay independent or partner early. If you commit to accelerated approval pathways, that increases upfront costs, and that actually might push you toward early partnerships to spread this financial burden. So each choice constrains the others. Yeah. So from your vantage point, working on deals and partnerships, when you're advising a founding team on how to sequence these decisions, what's the framework that you would use, and what's the order of operations that actually really matters?
So I do like the framework of sort of basing, or of being very aware of what your constraints are. And I think having 2 or 3 scenarios, 2 probably, makes a lot of sense. And what I advise people to do actually is to really be clear on what their goals are, because otherwise it's I could do this and I could do that, but really it's what's your objective? Is your objective to exit at at $300 million in 3 years, or is your objective to get to phase 1 with a potential therapy in 6 years, or what's your objective, right? Do you want to someday see your medicine in in patients? That's really the question. And that, because I guess a lot of if your goal is to exit in the cycle time that venture capital wants you to, honestly, that's not really adapted to the sort of development of a medicine. That's really just part of the cycle, and it may or may not help the medicine in the end. So I think I always start with what's the objective that they have. And that's where, again, who you surround yourself with and who's funding you and everything is a big question. right? Because that'll drive it to some extent. So that's really the key. But then I'm a big fan of just having some very well defined scenarios that you can and really highlighting the sort of constraints and the risks and opportunities, and then seeing opportunistically what fits the circumstances in your environment at that time.
What is the importance of market intelligence and competitive intelligence for the early stage biotech?
Um, I think that it's pretty important to understand what other like molecules are in development in your area, and how the standard of care is going to change, so that you understand the sort of commercial forecast. And by the way, apologies to all my commercial friends, but most commercial estimates are completely wrong every time. But at least you still need to understand what the standard of care is going to be, and who else is playing, and are you going to get, even if there's no cure. Actually, the hepatitis C cure is a great example. There was no cure. It was a huge deal. All of a sudden you could cure hepatitis C, and within years it was almost like commoditized to some extent, right? Because you had so many cures. And so just understanding what you're kind of going to be coming into is really important, even if it's early. And so just understanding what the field looks like, how many molecules are in development, who's your competition, who are the pharmas going to be like assessing besides you, that kind of stuff. You need to know early so that you can even choose how to run your program and what partnerships to select or to target.
So you and I are big proponents of focus and discipline. If you had to pick one or two mistakes you see founders make repeatedly, things that are almost entirely avoidable with better upfront thinking, what would they be?
Well, I think that sadly, I think that I've seen some real face plants on the PK side, just not having enough PK data. Either basically like the partnership will remain unnamed, but basically no decisions could be made because the PK was just all over the map for different patients, and that shouldn't happen, right? It shouldn't get to that point. But I've seen that a few times where it shouldn't have gone as far as it did, and that really relates to not having done enough work early on. So I'd say that's a big one. And then another. This is my please, everyone. Actually, probably right now, either people are kicking themselves already or they're not going to do it. But please don't like lease really expensive buildings when you're a startup. I mean, as a partnering person, if I walked into a building and I saw like a waterfall or something, I'd be like, oh, they're toast, right? I mean, come on, spend the money where it's needed. And when times are good, you see that. When times are bad, then you see, of course, the bankruptcies because they can't get out of their leases and whatnot. That's a very common mistake too. And sometimes it's a little bit of pressure from the network that they're in and stuff. But please don't do that, people.
And it also applies to hiring the C-suite. And as we discussed with Steve Potts last week, the celebrity hires, right?
Yes. How many VPs do you really need? Do you really need a lot of VPs? Like, I mean, sometimes it's like, dozens. It's not good. So yes, the celebrity hires. There's a lot of incredibly competent, motivated people out there with incredible experience. And so, you really don't need to do that. I guess just in general, what I see a lot of is that a lot of time and money could be saved with just the most basic good practices, like communicate, look each other in the eye. If you say that you do something, actually do it. No excuses. I mean, those sorts of really basic things, and those work wonders for partnerships too, by the way. That kind of stuff needs a little more kind of focus, because right now the sort of inclination is for everyone to do everything all the time, and that just leads to a lot of excuses. I mean, better to be focused and get a couple things done well than do everything.
So one last question for you. So you've been inside these large organizations like
Mhm,
Genentech and Gilead. You
mhm.
watch the deals and programs from the inside. Now that you're have your own consulting firm, what changed about how you think about these decisions early? And what do you see from the outside that you didn't see from the inside?
I think what becomes really clear to me from the outside, having been outside for like a year and a half now, is that there's a lot of stuff that's done organizationally that really isn't needed. Um, again, there's a lot of process isn't the right word, but there's a lot of work that's done that people don't need to do. Like focusing on what's really the priority is more clear to me. Like when you're in the middle of these large organizations, then it's so that you get caught up in sort of the organizational politics and how we do things, and but is the protocol really tight? You know, what did the data look like? Are they really clean data? Just being like efficient and lean and being able to kind of really hone in on what's important, I think is the part that jumps out at me the most now.
So, as we close, the core
Mhm.
insight here is simple but profound. Early fundraising decisions are not just about money, they're also strategic architecture decisions. They shape what's possible for your drug, for the company, and for your exit in the next decade. So, if you're thinking about starting or scaling a biotech company, the work you do before you raise capital is the work that actually matters the most. Monica, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate our friendship.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun. Thank you.